I sit in my thatched hut, the years heavy on my shoulders. The sun is sinking behind the horizon, painting the sky in a deep crimson glow that bleeds into the maize fields outside. The wind carries the dry scent of earth rustling through the stalks, while from the village in the distance, the steady rhythm of drums drifts across the evening air. On the small wooden table beside me lies a photograph, its corners frayed with age. The faces staring back at me are young, fierce, and hopeful men I once called my brothers. Some of them never came home. I trace the outline of one face with a trembling finger, and then I look down at the scar etched across my forearm, a reminder carved by shrapnel decades ago. The years have turned me into nothing more than a farmer once again tilling the same soil my father once worked. Yet the soil remembers, and so do I. I am no longer a soldier, just an old man who tends his crops. But memories are restless companions. They refuse to sleep, and tonight they rise again. I was born in a small village in northern Mozambique in the province of Cabo Delgado, where the red earth stains everything. It touches our feet, our clothes, even our memories. My father was a farmer bent-backed from years of tilling the soil that never seemed to yield enough. He grew maize, cassava, and sometimes cotton, most of which was claimed by Portuguese settlers under the weight of impossible taxes. My mother sold vegetables at the market, her hands always smelling of onions and dried fish. Together, they raised us a brood of children who learned early that survival was earned, never given. We lived in a mud-walled house with a roof of straw patched and repatched after every rainy season. At night, I slept on a mat beside my brothers, listening to the fire crackle and my mother's soft humming of Makande songs. In those moments, the world felt whole. The rhythm of drums from neighboring villages marked our festivals. The scent of roasted maize carried through the air, and the elders told stories of ancestors who had fought to protect the land. But even in childhood, the shadow of colonial power loomed over us. My father's face hardened whenever Portuguese officials came to collect taxes. My mother's smile faded when she spoke of neighbors forced to abandon their fields. Beneath the laughter of children and the songs of our people, there was always a quiet fear, one that would one day burst into fire. My childhood was bound to the rhythm of the land. At dawn, I followed my father into the fields, carrying a hoe that was almost too heavy for my small hands. We planted maize in straight rows, pressed cassava cuttings into the soil, and prayed for rain that did not always come. When the sun grew fierce, we rested under the shade of a baobab, drinking water from a gourd and listening to the cicadas hum. There were moments of joy, too. I herded goats along the riverbanks, laughing as they scattered like unruly children. With friends, I swam in the Rovuma River, letting the current carry us downstream until our mothers called us back with voices sharp as spears. In the evenings, the village gathered around fires to roast maize and tell stories. The elders spoke of spirits in the forest and warriors who had once resisted foreign invaders. Their words filled me with pride and a hunger I could not yet name. Festivals were the brightest days of my youth. The drums thundered, masks carved from wood came alive, and dancers moved like spirits possessed. My mother's singing carried above the crowd, and I clapped until my hands ached. For those few hours, life felt untouched by hardship. Yet even as a child, I knew that beneath the songs and laughter, there was a wound. Some fields lay abandoned because settlers had claimed them. Some fathers never returned from forced labor camps. Joy was always braided with sorrow. Life in our village was never truly ours. The Portuguese settlers claimed the best lands, leaving us with the rocky, unforgiving soil. Taxes were heavy, measured not only in money, but in cotton maize and forced labor. My father's hands, already cracked and calloused from years of tilling, bled under the strain of meeting quotas he could barely comprehend. When he faltered, the colonial officers punished him publicly, flogging him in the village square so that we children could see and remember. The settlers imposed their rules like stones in our path. Boys were forced into labor on distant plantations. Girls were watched closely, their freedom constrained by the fear of punishment. Education was a privilege few could dream of. Our teachers, if we had any, were Portuguese and taught only what the colonial authorities allowed, history that erased our ancestors and celebrated our oppressors. Even the markets were controlled. My mother's vegetable stand was inspected daily, and anything deemed unsanctioned or excessive was confiscated. Rumors circulated of neighbors disappearing, sent off to labor camps, or worse, their families left to wonder if they would ever return. Despite the constant fear, the village persisted. We sang Makande songs while working, exchanged whispered stories of resistance, and tended our small plots with a stubborn hope that the land might one day belong to us. Yet for me, even as a boy, the injustice cut deep. I watched my family lose not only the fruits of our labor, but our dignity. The fire of anger and resolve began to kindle inside me, a quiet ember that would one day grow into the roar of rebellion. I was too young to understand everything, yet old enough to feel the sting of injustice. I watched friends disappear, dragged away for resisting the settlers' demands. I saw my father humiliated, my mother weep silently as her vegetables were seized. Each loss, each act of cruelty carved a hollow space in my chest, a space that soon filled with a hunger for freedom. Whispers reached our village of a movement forming beyond the border FRELIMO fighters who dreamed of an independent Mozambique. My elder brother had already slipped away to join them in Tanzania, promising to return when the day came to reclaim our land. His absence left a void, but also a spark. I realized then that freedom was not given. It had to be seized. The soil we tilled, the rivers we fished, the songs we sang, they were ours by birthright, yet stolen from us. Something deep within me stirred. I clenched my fist in the dusk light, vowing silently that when the time came, I too would take up arms, not for hatred, but for the chance that one day our children would walk freely across their own land. That ember, small and fragile at first, would guide me through forests, battles, and the firestorm to come. I did not yet know what it meant to be a soldier. I only knew the feel of the earth beneath my feet, the weight of a hoe in my hands, and the sorrow of watching my village suffer. Yet the winds carried whispers of change, and the forest beyond our fields seemed to beckon. I would soon leave this life behind, the thatched roofs, the maize stalks swaying in the breeze, the laughter of children echoing through our village. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, and littered with the bones of those who had dared before me. And still, something inside me would not let go. I knew in the quiet moments before nightfall that I was being called to a greater purpose. The soil I loved would one day be free, and I would play my part in the firestorm that was coming. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp earth and roasting maize. I moved quietly through our small hut, packing only what I could carry: a worn knife my father had sharpened for me, a photograph of my elder brother, who had already fled to join FRELIMO, and a small bundle of dried corn for the road. Each item felt heavier than its weight, carrying the memory of home and the life I was about to leave behind. My mother stood at the doorway, her hands clutching the edges of her apron as if it could hold back the inevitable. Her eyes, wide and glistening, searched mine for a hint of reassurance. My father's face was stern, yet there was a tremor in his jaw betraying the pride and fear battling within him. We said nothing at first. Words seemed too fragile to carry the weight of what was to come. When I finally spoke, my voice shook. I will return when the land is free. Stepping outside, I felt the familiar soil underfoot, the maize fields swaying gently in the breeze, as if urging me to stay. But the forest beyond the village beckoned with a promise of something larger than myself. My heart raced with a mix of fear and anticipation. I could hear the faint rhythm of drums from a distant celebration, a reminder of life continuing in my absence. As I ventured into the shadows of the dense forest, the village shrinking behind me, a strange clarity settled over me. I did not know if I would ever see these fields again or the faces of my parents and friends. Yet, one truth burned brightly in my chest: freedom was a path I had to walk, no matter the cost. With every cautious step into the unknown, the road ahead felt both terrifying and inevitable. The forest closed around me like a living wall, the dense canopy filtering the sunlight into fragmented patterns on the red soil. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my heart racing. I moved quietly, keeping my eyes on the path ahead, aware that Portuguese patrols could appear at any moment. The smell of wet earth mingled with the sharp tang of sweat, and the air was thick with the hum of insects. I was not alone for long. From the shadows emerged other young men, some barely older than I was, their faces etched with determination and fear alike. There was Paulo, a thin boy from a neighboring village whose father had been taken to a labor camp. Amadou, a former schoolteacher who had abandoned his classroom to fight. And Jose, a robust farmer with hands as calloused as mine. At first, we exchanged wary glances, unsure if we could trust one another. But the forest demanded cooperation. Each step, each cautious movement built a fragile camaraderie among us. We walked for days, sleeping under the open sky, or beneath thick foliage, rationing the dried corn we had brought from home. Streams offered water, but also the risk of discovery. Nights were the hardest. The jungle seemed alive, with eyes that watched sounds that threatened to betray our presence. We whispered stories of our families, our villages, and the injustices we had suffered. These shared tales stitched our fates together, creating bonds that were stronger than fear. When we finally glimpsed the FRELIMO training camp, hidden in the depths of the forest relief, and all washed over me. The camp was a small cluster of huts and tents surrounded by watchful guards and makeshift barriers. Fighters of all ages moved with purpose, their faces a mix of exhaustion, resolve, and a flicker of hope. The air buzzed with whispered instructions, the clatter of weapons being maintained, and the distant echo of drums used for communication. I realized then that I had left the familiar behind, my family, my village, the red soil. I loved stepping into a world defined by discipline, danger, and a shared dream of liberation. Each step toward the camp was a commitment, a silent vow that I would endure what was necessary for the freedom of my people, no matter the cost. The first morning at the FRELIMO camp, the forest was alive with the sharp sounds of orders barked and the rhythm of boots against the dirt. Our instructors, veterans of early skirmishes, were unforgiving. They demanded precision endurance and an understanding that mistakes could cost lives. I had held a hoe and carried baskets of maize all my life, but now I was learning to hold a rifle to measure distances, to move silently through the undergrowth like a shadow. We practiced marching for hours, sometimes through waist-high grass, sometimes crawling under tangled branches, our bodies scraped and bruised by every obstacle. The instructors drilled us in hand-to-hand combat knot tying for traps and emergency first aid. The smell of gunpowder was constant, mixing with sweat and the scent of damp leaves. Even in the simplest exercises, tension hummed through our muscles. Every misstep was met with a sharp reprimand or a corrective strike. Meals were sparse and simple dried corn, a bit of salted fish when we were lucky. Hunger gnawed at our bellies, but it also honed our focus, teaching us resilience. Nights were colder than I had imagined. We slept on mats beneath the canopy, listening to the jungle sounds, the calls of unseen animals, the rustle of branches, the distant drums that signaled movement across the forest. Sleep was broken and shallow, but we learned to rest in minutes to wake at a moment's notice. We trained in small squads, which forced us to trust each other implicitly. Paulo taught me how to track footprints. Amadou shared techniques for setting ambushes. Jose instructed me in camouflage, showing how mud and leaves could hide a man's presence entirely. Slowly, fear gave way to focus, and hesitation transformed into calculated action. My hands, once only accustomed to the rough pull of a plow, now gripped a rifle with purpose. Despite the hardships, moments of camaraderie shone through. We shared stories of our families, our villages, and the injustices that had driven us here. Laughter was rare, but when it came, it felt like a fleeting rebellion against the constant tension. Bonds were forged not in comfort, but in shared struggle and mutual reliance. By the end of the first month, I was no longer just a frightened boy from a small village. I was becoming a soldier of the liberation movement shaped by sweat, pain, and determination. The forest was no longer simply a wilderness. It was a school, a sanctuary, and a battlefield in training. And as I lay on the forest floor each night listening to the distant calls of the jungle, I understood that the journey ahead would test every ounce of courage I possessed, but that courage had begun to awaken within me. The day of my first mission arrived with a tension that pressed against my chest. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of birds amplified in the silence. We were tasked with ambushing a small convoy of Portuguese soldiers transporting supplies through a narrow dirt path near our camp. Every step forward was deliberate. Every snapped twig felt like a drumbeat announcing our presence. My hands gripped the rifle with a mixture of fear and determination. Paulo beside me whispered instructions. Stay low, follow the rhythm of my breathing, and wait for my signal. I nodded, though my stomach churned and my palms were slick with sweat. The other members of our squad melted into the shadows like specters, each of us a part of a carefully woven net. When the convoy appeared, the moment stretched into eternity. I could see the glint of helmets, the rumble of wheels on the dusty road, the chatter of soldiers, unaware of our presence. The first shot rang out from Amadou, precise and sharp, and the forest erupted into chaos. Bullets tore through leaves and bark, and shouts of fear and command mixed with the rattle of gunfire. I fired once, twice, my heart hammering in sync with the explosions around me. Amid the action, tragedy struck. Jose, the robust farmer who had been guiding me in camouflage, fell to the ground, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. I froze, panic gripping me, but Paulo's voice cut through the haze. Move, cover, we cannot stop now. Instinct overrode fear. I pushed forward, helping the others to secure the area and complete the mission. The ambush was a success, yet the victory was hollow. We had achieved our objective, but at a cost I had not fully anticipated. The forest was littered with the wounded and the dead, friends and foes alike. I knelt beside Jose, feeling the weight of mortality for the first time in such an immediate, visceral way. Tears burned my eyes, but there was no time to grieve. Survival and purpose demanded action. Later, under the cover of night, we returned to camp silent, except for the muffled sobs of those who had lost companions. I wrote a letter to my mother, though I knew it might never reach her, telling her I was alive yet changed in ways words could scarcely capture. I had stepped into war as a boy from a small village. I returned as someone who had glimpsed both the courage and the cruelty that freedom demands. The forest that had trained me now bore witness to my baptism in blood, and I knew with certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. In the quiet hours after our first mission, we gathered around a small fire, its flickering light casting long shadows on the faces of my companions. The forest, which had been alive with the screams of battle hours before now, seemed eerily still. Each of us carried the weight of what we had seen, yet words were necessary to process, to connect, to survive. Paulo broke the silence first, his voice low but firm. "We all leave someone behind in every fight," he said, poking at the embers. "The forest takes them, but we carry their memory with us." His words resonated with all of us, a quiet acknowledgement of the pain we could not speak aloud. Amadou, the former schoolteacher, shared stories of his students, of lessons interrupted by colonial oppression, and of a home that no longer existed in the way he remembered. We listened rapt, and in turn, spoke of our villages, our families, and the injustices that had driven us here. Each story was a thread weaving us together into a fragile tapestry of shared purpose. There were moments of levity too. Jose, before his injury, had cracked a joke about how we would all one day become great generals of the forest, commanding armies of maize and cassava. We laughed quietly, the sound almost foreign after the chaos of the day. These fleeting moments of humor were like raindrops on parched soil, sustaining our spirits just enough to endure the trials ahead. Through these conversations, I began to understand the essence of camaraderie in war, not just in fighting side by side, but in sharing fears, dreams, and small joys. Each of us was different farmers, teachers, laborers, yet bound by the same resolve to reclaim our land and our dignity. The forest had made soldiers of us, but our shared humanity kept us grounded. As I lay down that night listening to the distant cries of nocturnal animals, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow, hope, and determination. I realized that the bonds forged in fire would carry me through the darkest days to come. By the time I had completed our first few missions, I began to grasp the larger picture of what we were part of. Mozambique in 1964 was a land divided a nation under the iron grip of Portuguese colonial rule. FRELIMO, the liberation movement, had formed just that year, organizing scattered uprisings into a coordinated campaign for independence. Our actions were not isolated skirmishes. They were part of a broader strategy to disrupt supply lines, weaken colonial control, and inspire the people to rise. News of battles in other provinces filtered through the camp in whispers. Towns attacked plantations, sabotaged villagers fleeing or caught in the crossfire. The Portuguese forces were strong, well-equipped, and ruthless, yet they could not anticipate the determination of people who knew the land, the forest, and the rivers as intimately as we did. Each mission we carried out, small in scope, was a thread in a growing tapestry of resistance. Understanding the history behind our struggle transformed fear into purpose. I no longer acted solely out of anger or survival. I was part of a movement that sought to reclaim our homeland, restore dignity, and secure a future for generations yet unborn. Every step through the forest, every night spent in hiding, was a contribution to a larger fight that stretched far beyond the borders of my village. The liberation of Mozambique was not a distant dream. It was the reason we endured the hardships that tested our bodies and our hearts every single day. As the days turned into weeks, the forest became both my sanctuary and my crucible. I had learned to move silently, to read the terrain, and to anticipate danger. I had seen comrades fall, felt the sting of wounds, and tasted the bitter weight of fear. Yet through it all, I had also discovered courage I never knew I possessed. The forest had taught me discipline, patience, and the power of unity. Each mission, each skirmish, reinforced the understanding that freedom was not granted. It was seized through sacrifice, strategy, and unyielding resolve. My body ached, my hands were calloused, and my heart carried scars invisible to the eye, yet I was becoming more than the boy who had left his village. Still, the hardest days lay ahead. The forest whispered of battles yet to come, of choices that would test loyalty and morality, and of losses that would cut deeper than any wound. I had stepped into the fire, and there was no turning back. In the shadow of the trees, I knew one truth with absolute clarity. The path to freedom would demand everything of me, and the coming storms would reveal the measure of a man. Dawn had not yet broken when we moved through the dense forest, each step carefully measured against the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath our feet. The target was a small Portuguese outpost near a plantation, a vital supply point that had to be disrupted. The air was thick with mist, and visibility was limited to mere meters ahead, forcing us to rely on whispered commands and hand signals. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and every rustle in the underbrush sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. Paulo led our squad, signaling with a raised hand. We fanned out, taking positions behind trees and dense shrubs, rifles, ready eyes straining through the fog. The distant sound of barking dogs and creaking gates warned us that the enemy was awake, alert, and dangerous. I could hear my own breathing sharp and uneven, and the thudding of my pulse like a drum in my ears. The first shot rang out from Amado, precise and controlled, and the forest seemed to erupt. Smoke curled through the air, mingling with the smell of wet earth and gunpowder. Shouts of fear and command echoed from the outpost, punctuated by the staccato bursts of rifle fire. My body reacted instinctively. I aimed, fired, and ducked, every sense heightened to a razor's edge. Beside me, Jose called out directions, pointing to enemy positions while covering my blind spots. Coordination was everything. One misstep could expose us to a deadly volley. We moved as one, a fluid unit, weaving through the undergrowth, suppressing guards, and destroying supply crates. The chaos was overwhelming, trees shattered by bullets, smoke stinging our eyes, the cries of wounded men piercing the fog. Time seemed to stretch seconds, elongating into eternity. I saw a young fighter stumble, blood staining the leaves beneath him. Panic surged, but Paulo's sharp command refocused us. Advance, protect the fallen, keep the line tight. Adrenaline drowned fear, replacing it with a singular clarity. Every action mattered, every shot counted. By the end of the engagement, the outpost lay in ruins. Smoke curled from smoldering huts, supplies were destroyed, and the surviving soldiers fled into the forest. We gathered panting, bloodied, shaken, but victorious. The price had been high. I counted missing comrades, checked wounds, and silently vowed never to forget those who had fallen beside me. As we melted back into the trees, the forest reclaimed its stillness, indifferent to the human struggle it had witnessed. For the first time, I understood the true face of battle, terrifying, chaotic, and yet strangely clarifying. I was no longer the boy from the village. I was a soldier baptized in fire, and the path ahead promised even greater trials. The aftermath of our first major battle left a silence heavier than any gunfire. The forest, once alive with the chaos of combat, now seemed to absorb the grief that hung in the air. I moved among the fallen, counting faces. I had come to know friends who had laughed with me only days before, now lying still and pale against the undergrowth. Jose's absence was the first I noticed. His absence and the dark stain spreading across his chest hit me like a hammer. I fell to my knees beside him, the weight of helplessness pressing down. Paulo shouted over the wind, urging us to secure the perimeter and tend to the wounded. Amadou dragged a groaning comrade behind a thick tree trunk, bandaging a deep shoulder wound with a strip of torn cloth. I fumbled with my own hands, tying a makeshift tourniquet, feeling the tremor in my fingers. The forest offered no comfort. The scent of blood mingled with the earthy decay of leaves and smoke each breath, a reminder of the brutality we had witnessed. My heart pounded not just from exertion, but from fear and guilt. I had survived while others had not, and the realization gnawed at me. Every time I glanced at Jose, I wondered if my next breath would be my last. The men whispered, sharing brief prayers and words of remembrance. There was no time for tears yet. Our grief found small expressions. A hand on a shoulder, a whispered name, a silent nod toward the trees that had witnessed our pain. We spoke in hushed tones about the family and villages we had left behind, our words stitching together the frayed edges of our courage. I felt a profound shift within myself. The battlefield was no longer abstract. It was a brutal teacher, forcing me to confront mortality, loyalty, and the cost of freedom. Pain was constant, both physical and emotional, yet it became a thread that wove our squad closer together. We learned quickly that in the forest, survival depended not only on skill, but on the bonds forged in shared suffering. That night, as I lay beneath the canopy, I traced the stars through gaps in the leaves and thought of those who would never see them again. The forest had claimed some, but it had also tempered us, shaping our resolve. I understood with a clarity born from loss that every step forward would demand courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the cause that had brought us here. As the days wore on, the forest no longer felt like a training ground, but a crucible for the soul. Each mission tested not only our bodies, but the very essence of who we were. I found myself grappling with questions I had never imagined. Were we merely trading one kind of violence for another? Every shot fired, every crate destroyed, left an echo in my conscience that refused to be silenced. I remembered the boy I had been, the one who tilled the soil and chased goats along the riverbank. That boy would have recoiled at the sight of blood, at the cries of men felled by gunfire. Yet here I was crouched behind a tree, rifle in hand, directing fire and giving orders with the precision demanded by survival. The duality was exhausting, to remain human yet be capable of acts that only war required. Paulo noticed my hesitation during a reconnaissance mission. "Do not let doubt paralyze you," he said quietly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We fight not out of hatred, but for the land that raised us for our people for freedom." His words comforted me, yet did not erase the gnawing questions. I wrestled with the morality of ambushing a convoy of striking soldiers who were men like me whose families were just as dear. In the evenings, we spoke in whispers, sharing our fears and regrets. Amado confided that he sometimes felt like a traitor to his own humanity, while Jose admitted to sleepless nights haunted by the faces of those we could not save. These conversations were lifelines, reminding us that beneath the veneer of the soldier, we remained human. I began to understand that war was as much an internal battle as it was external. The forest demanded obedience, focus, and ruthlessness. Yet my conscience clung to fragments of mercy, compassion, and memory of home. Each choice carried weight: advance or retreat, fire or hold, act or hesitate. Every decision was a thread in the web of survival and morality, and none were without consequence. By confronting these dilemmas daily, I grew hardened by necessity, yet tethered by conscience. I realized that to fight for freedom did not mean abandoning humanity. Rather, it was the struggle to preserve it amidst the chaos. The forest and the war had begun to shape not just my body and skills, but my very soul. The next mission began before dawn, the forest still cloaked in shadow and mist. We were tasked with intercepting a Portuguese patrol moving along a narrow river trail. Every step was cautious, every sound amplified in the dense undergrowth. Then, without warning, a burst of gunfire erupted from a ridge above. Bullets ripped through the trees and chaos swallowed us instantly. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side and stumbled to the ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood soaked my tunic, warm and sticky, and panic surged as I realized I could no longer move freely. Paulo and Amado appeared beside me, dragging me behind a fallen log as bullets pinged off bark around us. My vision blurred, every sound amplified the crack of gunfire, the shouted commands, the groans of the wounded. For a terrifying moment, I feared capture. The patrol was relentless, methodical, and well-armed. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet I could barely rise. Paulo held me, whispering instructions, and I followed them through sheer force of will, each step a battle against pain and fear. We pressed forward, crawling through mud, under vines, across shallow streams, until we found temporary cover in a ravine hidden by ferns and fallen branches. The wound burned, and I felt the cold seep into my bones as adrenaline ebbed. Amadeo tore strips of cloth from his shirt and wrapped them tightly around the gash. I could taste the iron of my own blood, the metallic tang, anchoring me to the brutal reality of war. The forest, which had been a teacher and sanctuary, now seemed indifferent to suffering. I thought of my village, my family, the maize fields, and quiet rivers I had left behind. Fear mingled with resolve. I knew that surrender was not an option. Capture could mean torture or death. Each breath became a prayer, each movement a defiance against the odds. My companions whispered reassurances, sharing the burden of pain, fear, and hope. By nightfall, the patrol had moved on, and we remained hidden, exhausted, wounded, but alive. The experience had stripped away any remnants of naivete. I had glimpsed the thin line between life and death, the fragility of freedom, and the raw cost of resistance. My body bore the scar, but my spirit, though shaken, had hardened. The forest had tested me and left me transformed, more aware of mortality, more committed to the struggle, and more bound to those who fought alongside me. Weeks later, intelligence came of a larger Portuguese supply convoy moving through the northern corridor near our camp. This time, the mission would be far more dangerous, a coordinated strike to destroy not just the supplies, but to cut off reinforcements. Our squad gathered at first light, the forest heavy with mist and the scent of damp earth. Every face was tense, every hand clenched around rifles that had already tasted the forest's violence. We advanced silently, moving like shadows among the dense foliage. The convoy appeared at the bend of a narrow trail, wagons creaking under the weight of supplies, soldiers alert but unaware of the ambush awaiting them. Amado signaled, and the first shots rang out, echoing through the trees. The forest erupted into chaos. Gunfire ricocheted off trunks, smoke curled into the misty morning air, and the cries of the wounded filled the canopy. This time, the losses were more immediate, more personal. Paulo was struck while covering our flank, his shout piercing the fog. I lunged to shield him, firing as I moved, adrenaline overriding pain and fear. Jose, who had guided me through earlier skirmishes, fell to the ground, his face pale and motionless. I froze, terror gripping me, until another comrade grabbed my arm and pulled me into the cover of ferns. The battle raged for hours, every movement a negotiation with death. Decisions had to be made in an instant: who to help, when to advance, when to retreat. The weight of command, even informal, as it was pressed heavily on my shoulders. By the time the convoy was neutralized, the forest floor was littered with bodies, both enemy and friend. The victory tasted of ash and sorrow. That night, we gathered around a dim fire, counting the missing and tending the wounded. Silence hung heavier than smoke. Letters to families whispered prayers and tears mingled under the canopy. I felt a hollowness. I could not shake a gnawing guilt for surviving, while others did not. Yet amid the grief, a quiet resolve emerged. Each life lost underscored the stakes of our struggle and steeled our determination to continue. By dawn, the forest seemed almost serene, indifferent to the human suffering that had scarred it. But for us, nothing would ever be the same. The second major engagement had taught me the depth of sacrifice, the price of freedom, and the unrelenting weight of war. I had learned that courage was forged in the crucible of loss, and that every choice, every action carried consequences that would echo far beyond the battlefield. The forest around us was alive in ways I had never fully appreciated until war claimed it as a battlefield. Sunlight filtered through dense canopies, casting shifting patterns of shadow across the uneven ground. Vines hung like silent sentinels, and the undergrowth was thick enough to snare an unsteady foot, forcing us to move with caution. Every branch, every rustle of leaves demanded attention. Every sound could be the herald of danger. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth smoke from gunfire and the tang of blood. Birds called nervously above, disturbed by the chaos below, while monkeys shrieked from the treetops. Streams murmured quietly, masking the faint creak of wagons or the soft footfall of soldiers. Even the wind seemed alive, carrying whispers of movement across the forest floor. Gunfire echoed like thunder ricocheting off trees, while the sharp reports of rifles punctuated the air in staccato bursts. The cries of men shouting orders or wails of pain intertwined with the metallic clang of weapons and the distant rumble of carts. Each sound was a signal, a warning, a heartbeat of the battlefield that demanded immediate attention. At night, the forest transformed. Crickets and frogs claimed the quiet punctuated by distant gunfire or the rustle of predators. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and the stars above offered cold, indifferent light. Every rustle could be a trap, every whisper, a threat. We learned to listen not just to survive, but to anticipate, to understand the rhythm of danger, and to move as one with the land we defended. In this forest, life and death were inseparable. The environment was both teacher and adversary, shaping our actions, our strategies, and our very instincts. It was not merely a backdrop for battle. It was an active participant, responding to each footfall, each crack of a branch, each gunshot. The forest held memory of struggle lost and the resilience of those who dared to fight for freedom. As the dust settled and the forest regained its deceptive calm, I sank to the ground, exhausted, bloodied, and hollowed by the day's events. The faces of the fallen lingered in my mind, their expressions frozen between fear and resolve. Each life lost was a reminder of the cost of freedom. Each breath I drew a testament to survival that came with a heavy price. I thought back to the boy who had left the village with nothing but a knife, a photograph, and a bundle of corn. That boy could never have imagined the things he would see, the choices he would be forced to make, or the lives that would slip through his fingers. Yet, somewhere in the midst of fear and chaos, I felt a strange clarity. War was not merely a series of battles. It was a teacher of endurance, morality, and the harsh realities of human nature. I realized that the forest had shaped more than my body. It had molded my mind and spirit. The adrenaline of combat, the grief of loss, and the bonds forged in shared danger had transformed me. I was no longer the naive boy who had once clutched his mother's hand. I had become a soldier of liberation, tempered by fire and shadow. Yet, even with this growth, the path ahead loomed ominously. The forest whispered of challenges yet to come, larger battles, strategic decisions, and consequences that would haunt our souls long after the fighting ended. I sensed that what I had endured so far was only the beginning. The crucible would intensify, and the toll on body and mind would deepen. As night descended, I stared at the canopy above, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. The war was far from over, and the forest would continue to test us. I drew a steadying breath and made a silent vow to carry forward, to survive, and to honor those who had fallen. Ahead lay the next phase, where the consequences of our actions would reveal themselves and where the cost of freedom would become painfully, undeniably real. We returned to camp under the cover of darkness, our footsteps heavy and uneven, the forest floor damp with the weight of blood and sweat. The silence among us was deafening, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the rustle of leaves. Victory had been claimed, but it felt hollow. The price was etched across the faces of those who limped beside me and in the absence of those who would never walk again. Inside the camp, chaos unfolded. Fires flickered, casting light over bodies laid out on mats of woven grass. Some men cried out in pain as wounds were bound with strips of cloth. Others lay still with vacant stares fixed on the canopy above. I knelt beside Paulo, who pressed his hands against a comrade's bleeding side, his jaw clenched with determination. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and smoke, an oppressive reminder of the carnage we had endured. I looked around and saw boys who had entered the forest as farmers and herders, now hardened into soldiers by loss. Their eyes carried the weight of battles far older than their years. Some prayed softly in Makande, whispering names of ancestors as though calling for strength. Others stared silently, their faces blank, retreating inward to shield themselves from the horror around them. Beyond our camp, the land bore its own scars. Villages near the fighting had suffered reprisals, homes burned, crops destroyed, and families displaced. The people we fought for were caught in the storm, paying a price alongside us. This realization pressed against my chest like a stone. The struggle for freedom spared no one, not even the innocent. That night, I lay awake staring at the wavering shadows cast by the fire. The cries of the injured echoed in my ears, mixing with the memory of gunfire and the smell of smoke. I felt grief, guilt, and a gnawing fear of what lay ahead. But beneath it all, there was also resolve. We had endured, we had struck a blow, and though the cost was unbearable, the cause remained clear. The aftermath of battle was more than just survival. It was a reckoning, a reminder that each step forward would demand sacrifice, and that freedom, if it ever came, would be paid for in blood, sweat, and the haunting silence of those left behind. In the days that followed, our leaders gathered us beneath the shade of tall trees, the air heavy with tension. The battles had cost us dearly, and every decision from that moment forward carried the weight of life and death. I quickly learned that war was not only fought with rifles and grenades, it was fought with choices each more brutal than the last. One evening, a messenger arrived with news that Portuguese patrols were closing in on nearby villages suspected of helping FRELIMO. We had two options: defend the villagers and risk annihilation, or withdraw deeper into the forest to preserve our strength for the broader struggle. The debate was fierce. Some argued that protecting the people was our duty. Without them, our fight meant nothing. Others reminded us that if we perished in one desperate stand, the larger movement would suffer a devastating blow. As a soldier, I had little authority, yet the choice tore at me. I thought of my own village, my parents, my mother's trembling hands the day I left. Could I abandon others to the same fate I feared from my family, yet I also saw the weary eyes of my comrades, their wounds still fresh, their bodies broken? Could we afford to throw ourselves into another battle we were not prepared to win? That night, I sat with Paulo and Amado, both of whom bore scars from our last encounter. "The struggle is long," Paulo said softly. "Sometimes survival is the greatest act of resistance." His words settled over me like a heavy cloak. For the first time, I understood that freedom was not won in a single battle nor in the defense of a single village. It was a war of endurance, and endurance demanded sacrifice not only of lives, but of choices that would haunt us forever. In the end, the order came withdraw. We melted back into the forest, carrying guilt as heavy as our rifles. The decision spared our lives, but left behind ashes where homes once stood. I felt the sting of betrayal, yet also the painful truth that no choice was clean in war. Every path carried loss. From that day on, I understood leadership not as glory, but as burden. To fight for freedom was to live with blood on your hands, not just from the enemy, but sometimes from those you could not save. Not long after our withdrawal, word spread through the camp of broader changes shaping the war. FRELIMO had begun to expand its operations beyond the northern provinces, striking deeper into Mozambique's heartland. Victories in some regions were celebrated with quiet songs and clenched fists, while defeats in others reminded us of the relentlessness of our enemy. The Portuguese, alarmed by our persistence, tightened their grip with harsher reprisals and new reinforcements. For us in the forest, these shifts meant constant adaptation. Supply lines grew longer and more fragile, demanding greater secrecy and discipline. Missions became bolder sabotage of bridges, raids on convoys, and coordinated ambushes, designed not just to inflict damage, but to send a message that Mozambique's people would not yield. Each campaign carried risks we could barely comprehend, yet the momentum of the movement was undeniable. At night, commanders explained the strategy around campfires, their voices hushed but resolute. We were no longer just a band of scattered fighters. We were part of a national struggle connected to men and women far beyond our province. The realization filled me with pride and a deeper sense of responsibility. Still, these political shifts brought heavier burdens. Every victory drew harsher reprisals on villages. Every campaign stretched our endurance thinner. I began to understand that war was not only measured in battles won, but in the resilience of people who refused to break under pressure. The struggle was growing larger than my rifle, larger than my small squad. It was becoming the pulse of a nation fighting to be free. Life in the forest hardened us in ways no training ever could. Each day was a lesson in survival, a test of endurance that stripped away weakness and forced us to adapt. We learned to move silently along animal trails, to drink from streams without leaving traces to conceal our fires, so that the smoke vanished into the canopy. Hunger became a constant companion. Sometimes we boiled wild roots or chewed bitter leaves to quiet the emptiness in our stomachs. Other times we hunted small game with traps we fashioned from vines and sticks. Disease stalked us like a shadow. Malaria and dysentery claimed nearly as many fighters as bullets did. Nights were spent shivering under thin blankets, listening to the rattle of coughs around the camp, praying the fever would not find us next. Yet, even in weakness, we pressed forward. The forest itself became both adversary and teacher, shaping us into soldiers who could endure more than we ever thought possible. Through it all, camaraderie deepened. Paulo shared his portion of food with me more than once, even when his ribs showed through his skin. Amadeu read scraps of news clippings aloud, keeping alive the belief that the world beyond the jungle had not forgotten us. In moments of exhaustion, laughter sometimes broke the silence, small, fragile sparks of humanity that reminded us who we were fighting to be. For me, the transformation was profound. The timid boy who had once clutched a hoe in trembling hands was gone. I had carried wounded comrades on my back, through swamps, stood, watched through sleepless nights, and faced the enemy with a steadiness born of necessity. Fear never disappeared, but I learned to master it, to bend it into focus rather than paralysis. Looking back, I realized survival itself was a form of resistance. Every day we endured was a defiance of colonial power, a statement that we could not be broken. With each hardship overcome, my conviction grew stronger. Freedom was not an abstract dream, but a living possibility, one we carved out with sweat, blood, and an unyielding will. The turning point came on a night when the forest itself seemed to betray us. A sudden raid swept through our hidden camp. Portuguese troops, tipped off by informants, descended with brutal efficiency. Gunfire shattered the silence, and the air filled with smoke and chaos. In the frantic scramble, I found myself separated from Paulo and Amadeu, faced with a choice that would mark me forever: flee deeper into the forest to save myself, or risk everything to lead a handful of younger fighters to safety. For a brief, paralyzing moment, I thought of home, of my mother's trembling eyes the day I left. Then something inside me shifted. I could not run. I shouted commands, my voice surprising even me, with its steadiness guiding the boys through a break in the trees, weaving us between rocks and streams until the gunfire faded behind us. When we finally reached a clearing at dawn, exhaustion pulled us to the ground. The younger fighters looked at me with a mixture of relief and expectation, as though I had become something more than just another comrade. In that moment, I realized the war had transformed me into a leader, whether I sought the role or not. Responsibility now clung to me like a second skin. The raid cost us dearly. Paulo was wounded and several comrades never returned, but it marked the beginning of my understanding that survival was not enough. Leadership was born from choices made under fire, from refusing to abandon others even when fear demanded it. That night, under a sky heavy with smoke and stars, I accepted the burden. I was no longer simply fighting for freedom. I was carrying the weight of lives, of trust, of hope itself. As the days turned into weeks after the raid, I felt the weight of change pressing heavily upon me. The boy who had once left his village clutching a knife and a bundle of corn was gone. In his place stood someone scarred by battle, tempered by grief, and shaped by responsibility. Every choice I made seemed to echo louder, every step in the forest burdened with the memory of those who no longer walked beside us. At night, I often lay awake listening to the forest breathe, reflecting on how war had carved new lines across my soul. The faces of fallen comrades returned in my dreams, their silence reminding me of the cost of our cause. Yet, amid sorrow, there was also clarity. The struggle was no longer just survival. It was a fight for dignity for generations to come. Leadership had come uninvited, but it had bound me more tightly to the movement. I carried not only my own hopes, but those of the young fighters who looked to me for guidance. Ahead, I knew lay battles fiercer than any we had faced and decisions even more agonizing. The forest whispered of an ending approaching, not of the war itself, but of my journey within it. The next chapter would demand everything I had left, testing the limits of body and spirit. And so, with resolve tempered by loss, I braced myself for the closing acts of a firestorm that had consumed my youth and reshaped my destiny. By 1974, the war had stretched across a full decade, carving scars into both the land and the people who fought upon it. The forest that had once been alive with our laughter and resolve now seemed weary, soaked with the blood of comrades and enemies alike. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion had become constants. Even the Portuguese soldiers we faced appeared worn down, their eyes dulled by years of chasing shadows through the bush. When the news finally came, it arrived like a whisper carried on the wind. A revolution in Portugal, the Carnation Revolution, had toppled the old regime. The empire that had once boasted of eternal control was crumbling, and Mozambique was to be free. At first, I could not believe it. After so many years of struggle, betrayal, and death, how could freedom arrive, not through a final bloody victory, but through words spoken in a distant parliament? When the ceasefire was declared, our camp erupted with cheers, tears, and embraces. Some fell to their knees, pressing their foreheads to the soil as though reclaiming it with their very bodies. I stood apart, my chest tight, overwhelmed by emotions I could not name. Relief washed through me, yet it was tangled with disbelief and sorrow. I thought of Paulo Amadeo and countless others who would never see the sunrise of independence. The price had been unbearable, and the victory felt both glorious and hollow. As I listened to the announcement of independence on a crackling radio, my heart swelled and broke all at once. We had endured, we had fought, and Mozambique would finally stand free. Yet I could not silence the question that burned inside me: was the freedom of tomorrow worth the lives of all we had lost yesterday? When the war was finally over, I set out on the long road back to my village. My legs felt heavier with each step, not from the miles, but from the weight of years spent in the forest. The path was familiar, yet every bend carried a fear that what I sought no longer remained. As I approached, the sight broke my heart. The village I had left behind was scarred by fire and neglect. Roofs of thatch had caved in, fields lay barren where maize once swayed, and the old baobab tree still stood, though its bark bore the marks of bullets. Yet amid the ruins, life clung stubbornly. Children played barefoot in the dust, their laughter carrying a fragile hope. Women carried baskets of cassava on their heads, their songs soft but defiant. I found my mother waiting, her hair now streaked with gray, her frame frailer than I remembered. Tears filled her eyes as she touched the scar on my arm, proof of the battles I had fought. My father was gone, claimed by illness during the harshest years of war, but my mother's embrace carried the strength of both parents. We sat together in silence, the sounds of the village stirring around us. Relief filled me, yet grief pressed close beside it. I had returned, but nothing was the same. The years had stolen too much. Still, in that moment, I realized survival itself was a form of victory. Though scarred and diminished, my people endured. And as I looked upon the village slowly rising from its ashes, I understood that freedom was not a sudden gift. It was a seed, fragile but alive, that would need time and care to grow. Freedom had arrived, but it did not erase the shadows that clung to me. My body carried the marks of war, a scar across my side from shrapnel, a persistent ache in my leg that never fully healed, and the weariness of years spent in hardship. Yet it was the invisible wounds that weighed heaviest. At night, I often woke in terror, the echoes of gunfire ringing in my ears. I saw Paulo's face in my dreams, his last command urging me forward, his voice drowned out by the chaos of battle. Sometimes I smelled smoke where there was none, or heard the cry of comrades long gone. The forest lived inside me even as I worked once more in the fields of my village. Neighbors treated me with quiet respect, calling me a hero, but I could not wear the title. Heroes were those who never returned, whose blood nourished the soil we now claimed as free. I was merely a survivor burdened by the question of why I had lived when so many others had not. Though Mozambique stood independent, I learned that liberation was only the beginning. The true battle was to rebuild not just villages and fields, but the broken spirits of a people scarred by war. And within me, the fight to find peace was the hardest of all. War stole my youth, yet it also gave me a voice. I had entered the forest as a frightened farmer clutching a bundle of corn and a knife. I emerged years later, carrying scars, memories, and the burden of countless fallen comrades. Looking back, I cannot say the price was fair, but I can say it was necessary. Without sacrifice, Mozambique would not stand free today. I tell my story not to glorify battle, but to remember. Too often, the voices of the simple farmer, the teacher, the fisherman, the ones who carried rifles out of duty, not ambition, are lost in the grand pages of history. Yet it was their sweat, their blood, and their unyielding hope that carved the path to independence. To the generations that follow, I say this freedom is fragile. Guard it with care, nurture it like the crops in your fields, for it was watered with more than rain, it was watered with sacrifice. And remember that true victory lies not in conquest, but in the dignity of living without chains. I pray that my children and their children after them will never have to choose between life and liberty as we did. May they inherit peace, and may they honor those who paid the price to plant its seeds. Now, in the twilight of my years, I sit once more upon the edge of the fields. The maize sways gently in the wind-golden tassels, catching the last light of day. Children run barefoot between the rows, their laughter rising like birdsong, untouched by the shadows that once haunted this land. I rest my hand on the soil, feeling its warmth. This earth has drunk our blood, yet it yields life again. My scars ache, my memories burn, but they are no longer only a burden, they are proof that we endured. I am no longer a soldier, only an old farmer watching the fields grow green. But as I gaze across the harvest, I know the truth. Our struggle was not in vain. The land is free, and in its freedom, so too lives the memory of those who gave everything.